There is really only one topic of conversation tonight. Everyone's talking about it. I'm sure you talked about it over the dinner table tonight. The calls for a Commonwealth Royal Commission, a federal national royal commission, into both the worst terrorist attacks on Australian soil and on the anti-Semitism that drove it. Those calls are now becoming deafening. The families of the Bondi victims have written a joint letter to the Prime Minister, to Albanese, pleading for a Commonwealth Royal Commission. A letter described by the Daily Telegraph as blistering and by other commentators as scathing. And they're not alone. I mean, many Conservative commentators, a lot of politicians, former Commissioner of Australian Federal Police, Mick Kelty, have called for a Commonwealth Royal Commission. And more importantly, the entire Jewish community of Australia has been clamouring for a Commonwealth Royal Commission almost since the day of the atrocity a couple of weeks ago now. There are around 117,000 Jews in Australia. That's around 117,000 Australians the Prime Minister is turning his back on. Now, you may have noticed that whenever the question of a Commonwealth Royal Commission is raised at a news conference, Anthony Albanese looks uncomfortable, would you say, or even frightened. Let me suggest that he is frightened, and in fact more than frightened, close to panic-stricken at the thought of a Royal Commission. But he did his best to push back at it today. Take a look at what he said.
Well, my heart breaks for the families of the victims of the Bondi terrorist atrocity. My job as the Australian Prime Minister is to act in the national interest. It is in the national interest for us to do the Richardson review on national security, on any gaps which are there in the conduct of our agencies, including the AFP, ASIO, ACIS, the interaction between the Commonwealth and state jurisdictions, any gaps which are there, and to then make sure that we act on the recommendations which are there. The government is responding quickly. We have had as well the envoy on anti-Semitism's report that we are busy implementing and working with her and working with the community on these issues.
He just keeps deflecting, doesn't he? He deflects away from the possibility of a Royal Commission. If you were watching that media conference he gave today, you would have heard him talk about looking at all the agencies, all the Commonwealth agencies. Nothing about looking at the Commonwealth government. Albanese keeps pretending, oh, there's no need for a Royal Commission. He's asked ASIO, former ASIO Chief Dennis Richardson to do this review. But a review of what? A review of policing and intelligence. It will not be a review of policy failures. That is beyond his remit. He'll tell us what ASIO and the AFP might have done better, but he can't subpoena documents from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. That's what Anthony Albanese doesn't really want you to know. He doesn't want you to find out how many warnings he had of a risk of violence to Australian Jews and how long those warnings sat on his desk while he did, well, let's face it, nothing about them. Well, now, finally, shocked out of his inaction, Albanese is, finally, talking about taking decisive action. Now, what all 27 million of us Australians can see plainly, because it's common sense, is that what he is doing now, he could have done 2 years ago. If he had done that, if after the disgraceful display of Jew hatred on the steps of the Sydney Opera House on October the 9th, 2023, if then Albanese had taken swift, strong, decisive action, would those 15 Bondi victims still be alive? Now, of course, no one can know that. We can't know the answer to that. But I suspect that Albanese is terrified that a Royal Commissioner might dare to ask that question, even if just as speculation that can never be answered. Albanese did, as you know, finally appoint an envoy to investigate anti-Semitism, but when Gillian Segal submitted her report, Albanese let it sit on his desk, gathering dust, for 6 months without taking significant action. He doesn't want a Royal Commissioner to ask questions about that. You can be certain of that. You have to admit how deeply embarrassing that would be for our Prime Minister. We can see why Albanese continually stonewalls, digs in his heels whenever anyone dares to mention a proper Royal Commission, a Commonwealth Royal Commission. The families of the victims in their letter say this. They say, we need to know why the warning signs were ignored. We need to know how anti-Semitic hatred and Islamic extremism were allowed to dangerously grow unchecked. We need to make sure this does not happen again. Now, that's exactly what Albanese doesn't want you to know. So what excuse does Albanese, backed up by other Labor ministers, offer? It's always the same excuse. A Royal Commission would take too long. I suppose you and I could reply, well, that's all right, Prime Minister, we're patient people, as long as it finally gets to the truth. But in giving this excuse, this, oh, it would take too long excuse, he is giving the game away. He knows every public hearing of such a Royal Commission would be covered by the media. He knows that talkback radio, letters, columns to the newspaper, social media would be full of outrage at what the Royal Commission was uncovering. And he knows this coverage, this outrage, would continue for the rest of this parliamentary term. Now, Albanese knows that this constant coverage would keep painting him as a failure, as the bumbling, faint-hearted bureaucrat who failed to provide any leadership, who failed to protect 117,000 Australians from hatred, danger, vilification, firebomb attacks, and finally, from a terrorist onslaught. So you and I can rest assured that Anthony Albanese is feeling desperate about survival, his own survival. And so he will block a Commonwealth Royal Commission with every breath in his body. So it's up to us, all of us, all Australians, to have put so much pressure on the Prime Minister and on his government that he is forced to finally crumble and give us the Royal Commission he fears.